Brilliant. Thank you, David, and good morning, everyone. Firstly, my apologies that I can't be with you in person today, but I'm delighted to be joining you virtually, at least for this fantastic conference. I've been invited to set the scene a little by talking about the wider importance of ponds. We're increasingly coming to understand that despite their small size, ponds are a fantastic resource of freshwater biodiversity. They're a crucial part of our freshwater environment. And so I'm going to this morning provide a little flesh to the bones of that statement, and to wrap up by thinking about what that might mean for the future of pond conservation. David, I don't appear to have control of the slides. Thank you very much. Our water environment is an essential provider of services to us. It provides us with a source of drinking water. It provides water for irrigating our crops and supplying industry. It helps us to manage our wastewater, and in good condition, it helps to protect us from flood risk. Yet, despite its importance, we have not done a very good job of taking care of our water environment. We know that nature is in decline across the board, but the state of our water environment is particularly poor. Our rivers, lakes, and other waters face a range of pressures, including a cocktail of pollutants, excessive abstraction, and the physical changes that we make to our water environment, which prevent it from functioning naturally. In addition, we need to think about our freshwater environment as consisting not only of the standing and running waters that we might typically think of, our rivers, our lakes, our ponds, but also the wetlands, which house a significant proportion of freshwater and of freshwater biodiversity. And almost 90% of these have been lost globally since the 1700s. And a large portion of that loss has been relatively recent, so not historic. At a time when we really should have known better, we've had a better understanding of the importance of our wetlands and our freshwater environment. And we really should have been trying to halt that decline and restore these important habitats. Collectively, these pressures mean that almost 1 in 3 freshwater species are at risk of extinction across the globe. And WWF's Living Planet Index shows quite clearly that freshwater species are declining more rapidly than any other group. On my next slide, I will show that the state in the UK, sadly, is not really any better. In the UK, we have a relatively good understanding of the health of our water environment. The graphic on the left shows that we consider both ecological and chemical health and combine these to give an overall indication of the health of our water environment. Currently in England, less than 1/5 of rivers are considered to be in good ecological status. And that means that they're not in good enough condition to provide habitat for the species that should naturally be found there. Worse still, not a single river achieves water quality targets, meaning that none of our rivers can be considered to be in good health overall. And the picture is similar for other water body lakes forming part of this monitoring system, including lakes, canals, estuaries, and coastal waters. We don't include ponds in this monitoring system, and that is an omission for 2 key reasons. Firstly, it means we don't have as comprehensive an understanding of the state of our pond resource, which is problematic when trying to prioritise conservation action. But secondly, it means that we're failing to consider all parts of the water environment. We need to stop thinking about our water environment in these quite siloed and segmented terms, because we're increasingly recognising that many species that use a particular part of our water environment also use other parts. And so we need to take a much more holistic and more catchment-based approach to thinking about the health of our water environment, because these freshwater systems are inherently connected. And biodiversity doesn't just rely on a small segment of our water environment, it relies on the whole piece. So we need to start thinking not just about the health of our bigger waters, our lakes, our rivers, but also the ponds and other small water bodies across the catchment, which are such a crucial refuge for freshwater biodiversity. On to my next slide. A study carried out across 80 square kilometres of lowland agricultural land in the UK compared the biodiversity of ponds, rivers, lakes, streams and ditches. And it found that ponds provided a greater component of regional biodiversity for both wetland plants and larger invertebrates. So this study illustrates the biodiversity importance of ponds. And similar studies have been undertaken in other parts of the UK and across Europe and have come up with the same answer. Ponds are a fantastic resource for freshwater biodiversity. My next slide will look at why then the importance of ponds has been overlooked. In a conference last year, pond guru Professor Farig from Carleton University spoke about a biodiversity theory that was prominent in the 1970s that assumed that a single large patch of habitat was inherently better for biodiversity than several small patches adding up to the same size, a theory that became known as SLOS, or single large over several small. And this principle was so prominent that in the 1980s it was adopted by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature as a principle which would underpin their approach to biodiversity conservation. And this view has persisted over time despite subsequent data reviews demonstrating that this is inaccurate. There have been a number of reviews undertaken over time, including one just a few years ago repeated by the professor herself, which looked at a range of academic papers and consistently found that ponds are particularly important for biodiversity. They have a greater species richness than other habitats of the same size. And in the odd occasion where this was found not to be correct, they were still important for a range of rare and threatened species. Yet conservation policy has not responded to this new understanding. A decade ago, the European Pond Conservation Network noted in their manifesto that ponds and their wildlife receive little legislative protection in Europe, and the situation hasn't really changed since then. The professor spoke about multiple reasons for this inertia. Firstly, intuition. We just naturally assume that a large habitat patch will provide better protection for the species which inhabit it. We have an emotional connection with large wild landscapes and we want to protect them. We hear about the damage of to small habitats in a conservation context. So, for example, we hear that habitat fragmentation is a major threat to biodiversity. And finally, there is a concern amongst practitioners and academics that if we start to articulate these ideas about small habitats being important for biodiversity, that it will be used against us. It will be used as a reason to justify habitat destruction. We don't need to preserve these large landscapes because small pockets will do. So for all of these reasons, pond conservation has been overlooked in the past. But if we think about it, there are a number of key reasons that help us to understand why ponds are so important from a biodiversity perspective. Firstly, they are particularly numerous. So despite their small size, they add up to a large habitat resource in total. They occur across the countryside, so in a range of different habitat types, different altitudes, different microclimates. And so they exhibit a large range of ecological niches which can be occupied by a range of different species. In addition, they act as stepping stones, allowing species to migrate across the landscape. And they provide refuges for species more commonly associated with other parts of the freshwater environment, but that can also make use of the pond resource. Altogether, these factors contribute to meaning that nationally around 2/3 of all of Britain's freshwater plants and animals can be found somewhere across our permanent or temporary pond resource. To demonstrate this in pictures, my next slide shows this variation. Ponds are home to a number of common and fairly widespread species that we might typically associate with ponds. Aquatic plants and marginal plants like the yellow flag iris, that provide a food source and a physical habitat for a whole range of common invertebrates like the common blue damselfly. But in addition to these widespread species, which often occur across the range of ponds, ponds are home to a number of freshwater species which have a more restricted distribution, like the great crested newt and natterjack toad. They're also home to uncommon species which are facing pressure across other parts of their habitat resource. So, for example, the reed bunting and the otter, who can use ponds as a part of their wider habitat requirements. And they're home to a range of species which have a severely restricted distribution. For example, the white-faced darter dragonfly, found only in deep pools on peat bogs. And pillwort are only aquatic fern, a species of pond muddy edges that's restricted to just a handful of sites on acid grasslands and heathlands. And finally, the white-clawed crayfish, a species which has been lost from many of its riverine habitats due to the impacts of crayfish plague carried by the invasive non-native signal crayfish. But ponds, being often more isolated, can provide a critical refuge for the species and now form a key part of its stronghold across many parts of the country where it does cling on. For people who like to see numbers rather than pictures, my next slide shows the findings of a comparison looking at data from the biggest survey of freshwater invertebrates across rivers and the National Pond Survey, and comparing data for all of the invertebrate groups which feature in both surveys. What we can see highlighted in green is that ponds are a crucial resource of freshwater biodiversity. They house greater species richness for a number of invertebrate groups than rivers. And in addition, they're particularly important for nationally scarce and red data book species. And if we look just at the bottom row, what we can see is that, perhaps surprisingly, ponds provide a greater component of freshwater biodiversity than rivers. And in addition, they are important for uncommon species. This means that collectively across the UK, they are a crucial reservoir of freshwater biodiversity. In my final slide, I will think about what this could mean for the future of pond conservation. Well, we hope that this increased appreciation of the biodiversity value of ponds will start to be reflected in policy terms in the future. We have a lot of environmental policy, for example, the 25-year Environment Plan, which underpins our approach to the conservation of the water environment. And currently, ponds are not reflected very strongly within many of these policy documents. So we hope that this appreciation of the fact that although they are small, they are particularly important for biodiversity will start to filter through in policy terms in future. We know that the pressures facing ponds are very similar, perhaps the same to those facing other parts of the water environment. But currently, the mechanisms that allow us to tackle these pressures often focus on larger water body types. So, for example, where abstraction by the water industry is found to be causing ecological damage to habitats, there is a mechanism that allows companies to try and reduce this abstraction pressure and look for alternative sources. But this currently focuses on rivers and on designated sites like SSIs and SACs. So perhaps over time we could start to apply these kind of mechanisms to support our pond resource as well. And finally, in terms of funding regimes, we would like to see this newfound understanding informing future funding opportunities that would support the creation, restoration, and management of ponds across the landscape. The funding picture is currently changing, and you'll hear a little more from me about that this afternoon. But we hope that this increased appreciation of the value of ponds will start to filter through all of these avenues over time and will result in us having a more pond positive future going forward. Thank you.